So welcome to everyone who has joined us. I'm Alison Carmel from Hamle, the Center for the Advancement of Social Media. You're here tonight joining us in the webinar, Shrinking Space, Digital Occupation and Silence Networks. We're very happy to be joined tonight by 4 speakers, we hope, still waiting for the last one. But I will start with an opening and we will introduce the speakers and why we think about this topic it's important to be discussed today. And then we will continue and have about 10 minutes with each speaker who will share different parts of the overall picture that we're trying to share with the public about the shrinking space for freedom of expression online, particularly related to the issue of Palestine. And then we will have a Q&A. So as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A. And if you'd like to introduce yourself, please also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And we thank you very much for joining us. Okay, so just a little bit of background about some of the guiding questions behind what we would like to discuss here. So at Hamle, I work on international relations and advocacy. And a lot of the work of Hamle is about looking at how Palestinians are represented online and where the space for freedom of expression and their digital rights is being reflected online. And in recent years, some of the issues that we've seen regarding shrinking space come from a number of different actors. So you have corporations and you have governments, you also have civil society and legal actors and academics and a number of different stakeholders who are involved in protecting the space for freedom of expression for Palestinians online. So tonight we hope to give you some of the chance to hear from different people who are working on this issue, and then also for us to have a discussion as a community a bit about the ways that we can work on this issue together. So thank you very much again for joining us. And with that, I would like to introduce our speakers. Just a minute here while I pull up the bios. Okay. Yeah, so this evening, first, we are going to have Nadim Nashif. He's the executive director of Hamle, and he has been a civil society activist for a number of years. And is also one of the founders of Hamle. The second speaker we will have will be Franck Magennis, a legal researcher at Al-Haq and barrister at the Garden Court Chambers. And next we will have Dima Khalidi, the executive director of Palestine Legal. And lastly, Stefanie Fox, the executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace. So these are brief introductions, but I will allow them to also maybe elaborate a bit and introduce themselves a bit more. But with that, I'd like to get started and hand over the Zoom room to Nadim Nashif.
Thank you, Alison, for taking the lead on this, and welcome everybody. I will be speaking more on the different strategies and tactics that have been used and until now are used by the Israeli government regarding the Palestinian content online. So as you may know, there is an ongoing war on, as we call it, on the Palestinian content online, on the narrative. Which narrative will be there, which content is legitimate and which is not. And as part of this struggle, there are different strategies on different levels that have been taken in the last few years. Actually, we can mark maybe the year of 2015, 2016 as the start of these kind of strategies and tactics. But there are strategies and steps taken by the Israeli government and the direct organizations or institutions of the Israeli government. There are other measures and struggles that are around, I call them semi-governmental organizations, because although they claim that they are NGOs, they are very much coordinated and in strategic level and even funded in most of the cases by the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And there are also the level of individuals who are pushing hate speech that I will speak about later. But if we take the focus around the Israeli government itself, so Israel, as I mentioned, since the last part of 2015 and the beginning of 2016, is using different methods of and tactics of surveillance, basically, of Palestinian content. Some of them are through algorithms that basically scan the social media and take out specific keywords that are built on there. So basically, the basic assumption is that all Palestinian social media accounts are being surveilled and followed and monitored through these kind of algorithms. And these algorithms give kind of red alert about certain content, and then different actions are happening against this content from Israeli side. Other technology that has been used in the past few years is also the predictive policing technologies. When we say predictive policing, we are speaking about a technology basically that had certain profile of mainly young Palestinian male in the ages of 17, 25, who living in certain governance of the West Bank, who wrote a few times the word martyr and shared pictures of martyr. So all of these kind of elements are inside this kind of technology or this software that basically, again, scanning the Palestinian social media accounts and trying to detect these accounts and to profile them as a risk account. And if somebody is in a kind of higher alert by the Israeli secret services, then they're also would be arrested, or in the minor cases, they would pick up the phone and call this person and threat him that, like, we are following you, we are seeing what you're posting in the social media, etc., etc. So this is something that has been used in the past few years. But there are other levels, like when this information is basically gathered, it goes to the cyber unit, which is a unit that is basically functioning from the Israeli Ministry of Justice. So all the surveillance, all the requests, all the different requests that are coming from different intelligence bodies, it's not only the secret services, the Shabak, but sometimes they come from the army or from the other arms, and basically reach this unit. So the cyber unit is the one that's responsible on the relationship with Facebook and the other social media companies. And basically, they are the ones who are submitting the official request for takedowns. So any content or any page or any social media account that by the Israeli definitions is against the Israeli law, or accused to be putting materials that by the Israeli definition is incitement, would be requested from Facebook to take down these materials. Now, I say by the Israeli definition because in many cases, there are kind of gray areas and cases of people who are writing things against occupation, things that are not violent, are not calling for violence, and still being taken down. We know that there is a close relationship between specifically Facebook company. I speak mostly about Facebook because most of the Palestinians are using Facebook as the main network, social media, and actually also the Israeli citizens. So that's why it's like the main struggle area or arena. And basically, as I said, these takedowns or these requests are being handed to Facebook. We know that in more than 85% of the requests are positively answered by the company normally, even in cases that are, again, very problematic against freedom of expression, and in cases also that people, now we are talking also that the complicated reality of occupation, it's not like a normal government in a democratic situation, but we are talking also a government that basically occupying another area by the international law, and the whole legal background is not very clear to which legal background Facebook are referring. But going back to the Israeli government, so basically the Israeli government and the cyber unit is requesting these requests, and as we said, a high portion of them are accepted. We have also the cases of lots of arrests because of Facebook incitement. We are talking about hundreds of cases every year of young Palestinians being arrested on the background of their social media activism. So these are part of the whole strategy. Another layer of this war on content, as I call it, is basically all these organizations and initiatives that have a very close relationship and ties with the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, led by, that was led basically, now there is a new government, but Gilad Erdan, the minister, he was like the main figure who was leading this. So there is lots of coordination that's happening with the initiatives like ACT-IL, 4IL, Memory, Canary Missions, and other kind of different smear campaigns that different organizations are leading. But the main point is basically to have people in a much more organized way reporting Palestinian content. And this is the application of ACT-IL, is one of the dominant in this area. Basically, there are thousands of people who are subscribed, tens of thousands of people subscribing to application. The application would notify you, send you a notification to report certain content at certain time. So the result is basically that there are, for example, a certain picture that is in Instagram being reported by hundreds of people or thousands in a short time. And this means that basically the social media platform will have to take down this content and to check it because there are so many people reporting this. So it must be a problem. And in this way, they kind of manipulate the system in a way that it's not one person who's really like genuine people who are seeing content that is disturbing, but there are groups organized who are repeatedly reporting different Palestinian contents, or in other cases also being encouraged to put some kind of positive feedback to certain content or to certain articles in some of the newspapers. So these kind of tactics are being used all the time. These groups are well coordinated. There are like tens of thousands of people. And they get funding also from the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, but they get funding also from other organizations and individual donors. And in a way, they are very much similar, their work, and very much coordinated again with the government. Adding to this aspect, there is the aspect of also individual hate speech that is happening and different threats and call for violence and for killing Arabs or Palestinians. As you know, as you may know, Hamlet has been doing in the past few years different researches around the Israeli hate speech against Arabs and Palestinians. And we, in the last report, for example, we found that every 64 seconds there is one post that contained hate speech and calling for violence against Palestinian symbols. And the huge amount, like annually, we evaluated around 500,000 posts, that such posts. All these posts are not dealt with by the Israeli law enforcement system. There's nobody who being arrested, for example, because of such posts, that some of them are clearly calling for violence and for killing and for rape and for torture, etc. And this gives the legitimacy for lots of people from, specifically from Israeli right-wing activist groups who are intimidating Palestinians and Arab citizens of Israel specifically in a very clear way and not being targeted by the Israeli law enforcement. Just to conclude on this aspect, so basically there is lots of, from a research that we did last year, within the Palestinian youth in 48 areas in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Jerusalem, we see that clearly Palestinian youth are more and more afraid to participate in their political opinions in the social media and try to avoid that. So basically 2/3 of the group that we surveyed said that they would rather not to participate their opinions in the social media because it's too monitored, it's too risky for them. This is all because of what I mentioned before from different Israeli tactics, but it's also unfortunately also from practices that is coming from Palestinian side, including the Palestinian Authority with a cybercrime law and the Hamas de facto government in Gaza that is also arresting and harassing, in some cases also ones who are criticizing its policies in Gaza. So the whole atmosphere basically in the social media from all these aspects are leading that less and less Palestinian youth are engaging in politics and in social media, and they're posting their opinion. I would stop here.
Great, Nadim, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that. That's really a good kind of overview of the situation as Palestinians are experiencing it here. And now I just want to also mention that Stefanie Fox from Jewish Voice for Peace has joined us. So welcome, Stefanie.
Thanks so much for having me. Apologies, I had a time change issue in my head, but I'm very grateful to be here.
Great, thank you so much. And now we will continue to go on to our next speaker. And I think we are going to be hearing from Franck next. Yes.
Thanks very much.
Yes, I'm going to pass over the Zoom room to you, Franck, and maybe just introduce yourself a little bit, the research that you worked on, and then the floor is yours. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks so much. So my name's Franck Magennis, and I'm going to be speaking to you all tonight about a report that I drafted whilst I was at Al-Haq in Ramallah from May to August of last year. We've yet to release that report, but its release is imminent. We're hoping to release it in the next week or two. Now, my report is entitled provisionally "Insult to Injury: A Response to Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs." So that's what I'm going to take you through today, is the content of the draft of that report that is soon to be released. A bit about myself: I'm a barrister called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2016, and in my practice in England and Wales, I have represented a number of Palestinian clients. I have a broad public and civil law practice, and in particular, I've represented Palestinians in the context of claiming for asylum and international protection. I'm also attempting to grow my practice in international law, and it's in that connection that I went to conduct legal research with Al-Haq in the way that I did. And I've also studied the Palestinian struggle for emancipation for more than a decade now, starting with my undergraduate degree at the London School of Economics in international history. One of the most interesting projects that I'm currently exploring in the context of my UK-based practice is to continue to represent Palestinian clients who, for one reason or another, find themselves wanting to make a claim for international humanitarian protection or for asylum in the UK, and to specifically advance the argument that subjection to Israeli apartheid amounts to persecution or, in the alternative, some form of human rights breach for the purposes of such a claim. So that's my background. I continue to practice in the UK, and I also continue to act as a researcher for Al-Haq. Now, what my report aims to respond to is 3 reports that were released by the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs. The first of those reports is called the Money Trail 1, which was released in May 2018. The second is called Money Trail 2, which was released in January 2019. And the third is called Terrorists in Suits, which was released in January 2019. Now, one of the things we need to do before we release my report is to update some of the contents contained. And I note that today, specifically, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs has released its latest smear attack. It's called Blood Money, and it claims to be an in-depth analysis of the ties between the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Palestinian NGO Adamir. So the MSA's attacks continue, and today is no exception, unfortunately. My report opens with a quote by Edward Said, which I'd like to share with you. In After the Last Sky in 1998, Edward Said said as follows: "To most people, Palestinians are visible principally as fighters, terrorists, and lawless pariahs. Say the word terror, and a man wearing a keffiyeh and mask and carrying a Kalashnikov immediately leaps before one's eyes. To a degree, the image of a helpless, miserable-looking refugee has been replaced by this menacing one as the veritable icon of Palestinian. Now, the reason I say that quote is relevant is that I'm here obviously to talk to you today about shrinking space, and shrinking space is one of the fundamental paradigms which I deploy in my report in an attempt to explore how to understand these Ministry of Strategic Affairs attacks in greater context. And so I'm going to take you through the contents of that report one section at a time. In the introduction to my report, I talk about the purpose and the audience. Really, the purpose is to respond to these 3 reports by the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And those reports contain a number of defamatory, untrue, or misleading attacks on a number of different Palestinian NGOs, including, of course, Al-Haq. And crucially, it also contains attacks on the character of individuals who work at those NGOs. And in the case of Al-Haq in particular, there are some very lengthy attacks on the character of Shawan Jabarin, who's the esteemed general director of Al-Haq. And so I conceptualized the audience of my report into three broad categories. The first is to communicate with NGOs and the broader NGO community, whether they're Palestinian, Israeli, or international, NGOs who are genuinely concerned with holding governments to account. The second is the Israeli government and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs itself. That's my second intended audience. We want to respond robustly to them to make it clear that they cannot continue to make these defamatory attacks on Palestinian NGOs without being met with a robust and forensic response. And the final audience that I have in mind is the third-party funders who provide sustenance to the NGO community in Palestine. And the MSA's reports are very clearly pitched at trying to dissuade those funders from continuing to provide the support that they do. Now, one of the legal frameworks that I explore, and I'll go into this in slightly more detail later, is the framework of defamation. And there's a spectrum when it comes to different legal jurisdictions' approach to defamation. You have on one side of the spectrum, you have what might be termed the US approach, where the First Amendment protects speech. And then on the other hand, you have the jurisdiction in which I find myself, England and Wales, which has a reputation for using defamation law to impose a burden on people who make allegedly defamatory statements to justify what they've said. So my report is, you might characterize my report in the spirit of the US approach, which is dominated by the notion that the antidote to defamatory speech is more speech. And so my report is a comprehensive attempt to respond to the way in which the MSA is trying to shrink the space of Palestinian NGOs and Palestinian civil society. I won't detain us too much on talking about my methodology, which hopefully will speak for itself when the report is released. Suffice it to say that in that section, I go into some detail about what shrinking space is. Simply put, the term emerged to describe a global process by which restrictions are being placed on the ability of NGOs to operate and hold governments to account. And in a 2017 framing paper, which was aimed at conceptualizing the phenomenon of shrinking space, the Transnational Institute defined the phenomenon as, and I quote, a concept or framework that captures the dynamic relationship between repressive methods and political struggle, including the ways in which political struggle responds to these methods to reclaim space, and the impact this response has upon how political struggles relate to one another. Its value as a framework is that it helps us to think through common trends of repression, including their sources, effects, and mechanisms which political actors are faced with. I mean, broadly, the term describes the process by which globally, but in particular in certain jurisdictions, and in particular in the Palestinian context, the space within which civil society is able to express itself and to critically interrogate powerful institutions, including governments, is being shrunk. And so people find themselves with less and less physical and virtual and social space within which they can express themselves politically and to criticize the institutions that govern them. One of the other things I discuss in my framework is the paradigm of colonialism, empire, and the well-worn distinction between core and periphery. And I think that's an important framing device. The next section of my report then is, the second section is entitled Allegations Against Al-Haq. And what I attempt to do there is to paint a more accurate picture of Al-Haq, to make transparent its already transparent funding mechanisms, and in that section I forge a robust response in which the misleading and defamatory characterization of al-Haq is effectively corrected by pointing to the absolutely vital work that al-Haq continues to do. The third section then of my report concerns allegations that are made against individuals at al-Haq, and in particular, there are 5 named individuals who are attacked at various points in the various reports. But what's particularly egregious is that many of you will know, of course, Shawan Jabarin, and many of you may be familiar with the fact that some years ago, several decades ago now, he was tortured by the Israeli government. And in a rare victory, I think it's fair to say, for Palestinians, the fact of his having been tortured was acknowledged finally, following the intervention by former US President Jimmy Carter, who intervened on Mr. Jabarin's behalf with the Israeli authorities, who conducted an investigation which concluded that he had been tortured. Now, it's the horrific fact that the general director of al-Haq was tortured, which provides the paradigm which I chose to name my report after, right? Because one of the ways of understanding these defamatory attacks on the character of Palestinian human rights defenders like Mr. Jabarin is that it is adding insult to very grave injury. In the case of Mr. Jabarin, this is a man who was seriously tortured and administratively detained for years of his life. And he now, having already been through that ordeal, finds himself having to respond to just a chorus of unsubstantiated defamatory attacks on his character. And so my third section, the third section of my report, is an attempt forensically to respond. And I think it's no secret that I took my skills as a criminal defense barrister to that brief, and I responded as though these people who were being attacked were my clients, so to speak. And I responded to the attacks on their characters as I would do in a criminal defense context. And that brings me on to the fourth section of the report, which talks about the accusers themselves. Because those of you familiar with criminal procedure will be aware that when a witness in a criminal case makes an attack on another person's character, they open themselves up to having their own character examined. And so the fourth section of my report is an attempt to explore the lack of credibility that characterizes the people making these allegations, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in general, and its minister Gilad Erdan in particular. I seek to demonstrate the way in which they are, so to speak, standing in a glass house, and that they are themselves subject to attacks on their own credibility for reasons that I explore in some detail in that section of the report. I do then look at the effect that Israel's attempts to defund NGOs in general is having. And I look at various European countries and the way in which they've been pressured into defunding the vital work that's being done by the vibrant ecosystem of NGOs that exist in Palestine. And then I turn to the final section of the report. I had wanted to put it at the beginning, but my colleagues at al-Haq thought that maybe the law should come at the end. It's not perhaps as interesting to people as it is to us lawyers, but it's an important framing device nonetheless. And there are several aspects to my legal analysis and my attempt to situate these MSA reports and the smear campaign and the broader smear campaign and these defamatory allegations. You know, I'm attempting to place them in a legal context, and I do a fair amount of work under different headings. But two of the headings to which I'd like to draw attention are, sorry, three of the frameworks, the legal frameworks. The first is this occupation legal framework. Plainly, Israel's occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories is governed by various international legal regimes, including the Hague Regulations of 1907, the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, and in particular, what I seek to do is to develop a novel argument around Article 43 of the Hague Regulations, which imposes obligations on Israel as the occupying power to temporarily govern the territory and ensure, as far as possible, that public order and civil life continues, and it must do so while respecting, unless absolutely prevented, the laws in force in the country. And so as such, what I seek to argue is that Article 43 of the Hague Regulations requires Israel to respect the edifice and the structure of Palestinian civil society, and by attempting to defund and defame Palestinian NGOs in this way, it is in fact in breach of its obligations under international law. The second framework that I'll briefly touch on is that of defamation. Now, it's an area of law that's underdeveloped within 48 Israel, but it's worth considering the possibility whether these defamatory attacks could form the basis of defamation claims in other jurisdictions. And of course, when seeking to bring a defamation claim in England and Wales, which is the jurisdiction with which I'm most familiar, you do have to justify bringing it in the forum. But it might be thought persuasive on its face to suggest that a state governed by an apartheid regime that systematically discriminates against Palestinians is not the correct forum in which to bring an allegation that people's character is being unjustifiably attacked. The third aspect of the legal analysis, which I want to address you to today, is the question, or concerns the question, of apartheid and racial discrimination. And that's because it's my central contention in the report, in this section of the report, that it would be impossible to properly understand the MSA's smear campaign, the way in which it is perpetuating this shrinking space within Palestinian civil society, without understanding the broader apartheid regime that governs the Israeli state. Now, one of the reasons why I think it's important, though I appreciate that in some circles, the allegation that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid is considered contentious, it's my contention in the report that to prevent Palestinians and their political allies from exploring the allegation of apartheid would be to perpetuate the very attempt by the MSA to silence Palestinians. Even if people consider the allegation controversial or wrong, they're entitled to that view, but Palestinians, in their diversity, are entitled to express that allegation. It's also important, I think, that to note that consideration of international crimes, such as the crime of apartheid, falls squarely within the range of legitimate activity that an NGO can be expected to undertake. And so, in pursuit of Al-Haq's commitment to upholding international law, it's entirely proper that the allegation of apartheid should be explored. And of course, Al-Haq has ongoing submissions before the International Criminal Court, including allegations that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. So I seek to situate the shrinking space paradigm within the existing legal paradigm of the crime of apartheid as codified by the Rome Statute 2002. And so I'll draw my talk to an end because I don't want to deprive other people of time and questions, but a few concluding thoughts, three broad concluding thoughts. The first is that one way of conceptualizing the problem that Palestinians continue to face in their struggle for emancipation is that there has been a failure to give voice to Palestinian self-determination. And specifically, there is a very limited institutional framework through which Palestinians are able to express themselves politically. And it's because of the suppression of Palestinian political representation that the NGO community has come to be quite so important, because in the absence of proper representative democratic structures, NGOs come to be one of the few spaces in which Palestinians can still criticize the occupation and the apartheid regime that governs them. And so it's the relentless colonial and apartheid logic of the Israeli state that requires it to suppress Palestinian speech. And so it's absolutely vital that we resist these attacks, because NGOs are a lifeline. They're one of the few spaces where Palestinians can still express themselves faced with Israeli apartheid. The second of my concluding thoughts is that it's important to continue to try to develop creative legal approaches to push back against these attempts to freeze out Palestinian speech that's critical of the Israeli occupation and the apartheid regime that governs Israel. And the third and final thought is that, I come from Ireland. I was born in Dublin and I grew up in the 6 counties in the north of Ireland, and we have our own experience of colonial oppression. We fought and continue to fight in some ways our own struggles for emancipation from British imperialism. And without wanting to draw facile comparisons between the Irish experience and the Palestinian, there are nevertheless important links and commonalities, common experiences centering around language and violence and colonization that Palestinians have always acknowledged. And so my third and final thought is that I think there is more that could be done, and I'm committed to trying to help to do it, to link up the way in which shrinking space as a phenomenon can manifest itself in Palestine, and the way in which we see it manifesting in other contexts around the world, specifically places like Brazil, the USA under Trump, Brazil under Bolsonaro, Hungary under Orban, and India under Modi. These are places which, again, while they have differences from the Palestinian struggle for emancipation, are nevertheless witnessing similar attacks on NGOs. And it's my contention that Palestinians should continue to look outwards to people in other contexts and geographies who are facing the alarming phenomenon of shrinking space. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for your time.
Great, Frank. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. There's a lot of, I think you've really touched on some key pieces of where we do have to turn our attention. And part of the reason I want to say that we put this webinar together is because after several years of these attacks, Palestinian civil society has really been making more of an effort now to, like you said, to respond to defamation with free expression. So your research is an expression of that, and we do really look forward to seeing it and have it contribute to the wealth of knowledge we're building on this topic. So thank you. Similarly, I just wanted to mention, because I didn't mention it before, that Hamla will also have a brief position paper being published on the topic of smear campaigns and a lot of what Nadim Nashif was speaking about earlier. So if you did miss an earlier talk, this has been on Facebook Live and is recorded and will be on YouTube. But also there will be publications that will be coming out and that we'll be sure to share between our networks in the future. So without taking any more time, I am going to turn over the Zoom room now to Dima Khalidi from Palestine Legal. Welcome, Dima.
Thank you, Alison. Really grateful to Hamla for organizing this. For those of you who don't know, Palestine Legal is based here in the US, and our work is really to confront this shrinking space that we're talking about, to protect the movement for Palestinian rights in the US from various attacks that are trying to undermine it and really intimidate people into silence. That is really the intent of all of these different kinds of attacks. So what I want to do today is just give a couple of examples of the ways that people and groups are being targeted online. You know, this concept of shrinking space online, these will illustrate the ways that different tactics are being used and are reinforcing each other in order to achieve you know, the silencing effect and intimidation effect. And then I'll share some reflections from that. First, you know, one of the biggest targets of Israel and its allies has been the student movement for Palestinian rights, especially in the US, where, you know, we've seen over 200 student groups, Students for Justice in Palestine groups that are active on their campuses and challenging the discourse and bringing divestment resolutions and really having an effect on this debate around Israel-Palestine. So for years, we've seen the national Students for Justice in Palestine conferences, which happen annually, and they're gatherings of a few hundred students to learn and to share skills and to really strategize together. These conferences have been attacked for the last several years. And last year, the conference was happening at the University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota SJP group hosted it. Beforehand, there was a months-long campaign, and this has become pretty routine, to get the university to cancel the conference. And so we saw mainly outside, off-campus, non-student lobby groups pressuring the university. One of those was Act Ill, right, that Nadim mentioned. This app, funded partly by the Israeli government itself, had a mission. You know, they have these missions and they have points that they give people for completing the mission. And they directed people to complain that there was an unsafe environment at the University of Minnesota because of this conference. And they called for the university to increase security presence because there's, you know, because SJP posed a threat to safety. We also saw Canary Mission, that Nadim also mentioned, post a petition that was accusing students of inciting violence against Jewish people, and also called on the university to adopt a redefinition of anti-Semitism that we're seeing promoted around the world, the so-called 3Ds definition, the so-called International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. It has several names, but its main purpose is to try to encompass any and all criticism of Israel into a definition of anti-Semitism. We also saw anonymous websites publishing reports that were accusing the facilitators of the conference of support for terrorism. Again, these completely baseless allegations that we see again and again that are kind of self-reinforcing, but baseless allegations that are trying to pressure the university, scare the university into canceling the conference and upping the security and scrutinizing students, etc. So you had all of these different groups pressuring the university at the same time, getting hundreds of people to write the university, etc. The university resisted the pressure, and ultimately the conference did take place with hundreds of people. But during the conference, an online group, kind of McCarthyite in its approach, called Radical Alert, they posted pictures of some of the attendees, and they labeled them Jew haters, and they linked to their social media accounts. And on the ground, there were people physically taking pictures of students coming in and out of the conference. And they were just, we don't know who they were, unidentified people. So of course, students tried to cover their faces, protect themselves. And this then resulted in dozens of racist and violent threats against these students who were largely Arab, students of color, Black and Jewish. These alerts were asking people to harass and to bully these individuals. And of course, they pointed to the fact that they're trying to hide their faces. They're trying to hide something. They have something to hide. Implying that they were bad and that they were up to something, up to no good. So that's one example that I think illustrates a few themes that I'll get back to. Another example is in 2018 at George Washington University in DC, Washington, DC. There, a student senate was voting on a divestment resolution that was trying to urge the university to divest from companies complicit in Israel's human rights abuses. And it had failed the year before, and supporters of that previous resolution were targeted by Canary Mission. Their profiles were put up, they were targeted in different ways. So when they tried again in 2019, they were ready to vote, and the vote was postponed after student senators were threatened. Some got emails comparing them to Nazis. Unidentified people on campus were putting up threatening posters with a Canary Mission logo on it. And they tried to call pro-Palestinian students fake Jews, those who were Jewish, and anti-Semitic, and telling them to not be cowards and to vote publicly for or against the resolution. The vote was rescheduled and the ballots were cast in secret in order to avoid the retaliation that was being threatened, and the same kind of retaliation people faced the last year. And then during the hearing, which incidentally passed overwhelmingly, but during the hearing, there were two men, unidentified men, one in a canary costume, a yellow bird costume, standing outside of the voting room. And they were also seen putting up posters saying, SJP, you saw two of us, we saw all of you, right? After the vote, Act Ill, again, also put up a mission asking the users, asking their followers to like and share a Facebook page that was set up to threaten and to bully the student senators who voted for the resolution. So, you know, even in reaction to this, even the student group that was opposing the resolution, called GW for Israel, condemned Canary Mission and other groups for intimidating the students and the smear campaign, calling the attacks on the JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace students, anti-Semitic, right? So the students themselves, even those opposing the resolution, saw this as outsiders trying to influence their process, their internal student process. So, you know, those are the two examples that I wanted to share. And what some of the takeaways here for me are, you know, one, that these attacks are really part of a much larger effort that we're talking about to undermine this growing movement, this grassroots movement, this diffuse movement. There's not one group or one person or one area that this movement is growing in, right? And it's funded, as Nadim mentioned, not only by Israel itself, but by multi-billionaires like Sheldon Adelson. There's tens and tens of millions of dollars being poured into this effort. And in the US alone, there are dozens of groups that are engaging in these efforts on different levels. Palestine Legal has analyzed the kinds of tactics that are being used. So we're seeing everything from lawsuits being brought against academic associations or food co-ops that endorse boycotts, for example. So lawsuits against universities that allow Palestine organizing to happen, as happened against San Francisco State University and Professor Rabab Abdelhadi. Numerous legal complaints as well. We have legislation, of course, targeting Palestine advocacy, and this includes anti-BDS laws that we now have in 28 states of our 50 states, as well as laws trying to redefine anti-Semitism, as I mentioned, to impose this definition of anti-Semitism that would encompass any criticism of Israel. We also are seeing huge pressure campaigns on institutions like universities or libraries or museums, trying to get them to cancel events, trying to get them to monitor or investigate and punish activists for their speech activities, and claiming that they're anti-Semitic, that they're threatening, that they're pro-terrorist, whatever it takes to create this fear factor and to get these events scrutinized and these people scrutinized. We're also seeing attempts to criminalize these speech activities. So organizations ask law enforcement to investigate activists for their speech activities. And then there are the smear campaigns that are really targeting individuals. That includes the online intimidation we're seeing. At the same time that Israel groups are mobilizing hundreds of people to harass individuals on social media, they're also getting them to complain about Palestine advocacy online. So what Nadim mentioned, this reporting to Facebook and to Twitter and to YouTube and whatever platforms we're talking about, to take down posts and to freeze accounts. So there's this harassment on one hand and this censorship on the other that's happening. So, you know, all of these tactics are really mutually reinforcing. You know, the attempt to define Palestine advocacy and criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, and the attempt to smear people and their advocacy as pro-terrorist, all reinforce efforts to criminalize and efforts to smear people and intimidate them. And so they're calling on different state apparatuses and different institutions and companies, social media companies, to act on these accusations and to censor and thereby, you know, progressively shrink the space that people have to engage on this issue. The other point I want to make is that there's this really troubling cycle of, you know, the bullying that happens, and then the chilling effect that leads people to self-censor and to take precautions to protect themselves and to protect their spaces, to engage in this advocacy and this organizing. And then, you know, more bullying, right? With accusations that there's something to hide, and look, you know, that these people are trying to be anonymous, when in fact, you know, it's these groups and the Canary Missions and the Radical Alerts and AppIll that are anonymous, right? And that are hiding behind this veil of secrecy and making these baseless allegations. The other important point I think here is that the examples I gave really illustrate how many different groups are involved here in just one incident or situation. And these are coordinated campaigns, clearly. And they're mainly being undertaken by unaffiliated and really unaffected outside actors here that are bringing pressure to bear in a lot of different forums. So they call on administrators, and there's an online bullying campaign happening, and there are reports being produced trying to give a veneer of authority to these claims. But what's most disconcerting, I think, is the physical element here. You know, there's this physical surveillance that's happening at the same time that's facilitating the online bullying. And that makes it more real and more threatening and scary for people who know that there's somebody taking a picture of them. There's somebody noting, you know, their names when they get up to speak at a divestment hearing about, you know, why they support divestment and how they're Palestinian and they, you know, have experienced all human rights abuses and they can't go back to whatever the case. You know, as soon as they speak up publicly, they know that their names can end up on Canary Mission and they can be smeared and attacked in different ways. So this physical element that is combined with the online harassment, it really brings another dimension to this attack. So finally, you know, the chilling effect is real. You know, we hear from activists frequently about their fear of speaking out, their fear of signing their names to something, you know, their fear of not being able to go back home to Palestine because they're being blacklisted and identified and smeared and attacked in these ways. You know, this is just for speaking publicly for Palestinian rights. So, you know, the other part of it is that the effects of the bullying are really real as well. You know, people are traumatized. People are scared to walk around on their campus alone. You know, there's this real fear that people are watching them, that every move they make is being surveilled, and that results in this kind of self-censorship that I think we're talking about here. That's ultimately really the intent of these efforts. It's to scare people into silence, to make sure that this activism comes at a cost, that people can't engage on this issue without having to weigh and to calculate, well, is it worth it, right? So I think there are a couple points I'd like to make, because this sounds really overwhelming, and it's scary. It is scary, the kinds of resources that are being brought to bear against individuals and groups here. But I do want to highlight that there are ways to challenge it, and really this attack is responding to the power of the organizing that's happening, to the way that this organizing is changing the discourse, and that's what it's trying to prevent. It's trying to prevent a further slipping away of the Israeli narrative, so I think what's so crucial here is to emphasize how important it is to overcome the fear and the intimidation, to organize together, to support each other against these attacks, and to keep going, because that's really what they want, is for all of us to stop. So certainly that's what Palestine Legal is there for, to encourage people, embolden people, support people going through these kinds of attacks. But I think there are really important organizing efforts happening. And also, when we do respond to these attacks, it takes away it distracts us from what's really happening and from our efforts to expose Israel's injustices. So it is important to also keep doing what we're doing, because it's working, right? We can talk about the kind of legal aspects of this and ways to legally challenge things, but I think it's really more powerful and important to think about the organizing possibilities here, and to really recognize that this is not just happening to our movement. This is happening to other social justice movements, where we're seeing doxing of activists, and laws trying to criminalize Black Lives Matter and indigenous and environmental activists. So it's really important to also join forces and see this issue as connected with a broader problem of shrinking space and attempts to criminalize our advocacy for justice and human rights. Thanks.
Great, Dima. Thank you very much. Yes, I think as the conversation is developing here, we're really starting to see, some of the commonality between the different speakers, and also to hear from the experience of the students, and to see some of the picture of how this is happening also in the US, offline and online, how there's a chilling effect in Palestine and a chilling effect in the US amongst the advocates. And how also this is a part of a global issue. So with that, I think it's perfect that we will move on to our activist colleagues, and welcome the new Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace. Welcome, Stefanie Fox. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, and wonderful to hear from my co-panelists. I don't have that much to add, but I'll jump in and just share a little perspective as an organizer in the movement for over 10 years, here at my organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, sort of what we've seen as a Jewish American organization, what we've seen as an organization endeavoring to support the grassroots US base in support of Palestinian rights and freedom. I love the commonalities kind of linking between our analyses of how we see this, this trend impacting our organizing and activism. And I think I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about like the who we see this hitting, and the different tactics and hows, which we've already heard a good deal about, and a little bit about who to hold accountable, who to blame, underlining a few points that have already been made, and then just end with a few remarks about kind of how we understand this in the context of the movement as a whole. When I was thinking about coming and talking today, I was just thinking about a few just vignettes flashed in my mind from over the years of the first thing I thought of was incredible Palestinian poet Dareen Tatour, who of course was arrested in the middle of the night in 2015 for literally posting a poem on Facebook. And I remember at the time being so, not surprised because these tactics started long before that, but also to see how directly a Facebook post instantaneously was linked to an arrest in the middle of the night, and the Israeli security state being able to clamp down in that way. And so not just like shrink the space in a theoretical way, but actually literally imprison someone immediately as a result of a poem online, just underscores the true point of all of the chilling effect, right? Is to actually say, no, your poetry makes you belong in prison, right? It's just like that deep apartheid logic, as you were saying, Frank. I've also thought about, as Dima put such a fine point on, many students over the years so scared for, as Palestinian students, scared for their families or their future prospects as a result of trying to speak up for what's right and what they believe in, even to tell their own family stories. Or moments where I've felt like my work has been to be kind of midwifing new activists into the movement who maybe have come from deep, long history in other social justice movements, but have been astonished by the level of coordinated bullying that happens when they start to speak out on Palestine next to other issues they've been speaking out to for a long time. And so when I think about the who, for us at JVP, it's always important that we center and are clear that it's Palestinians that the chilling effect is intended to foremost to chill, right? And that it's an attack and an extension of occupation and apartheid to Palestinians digitally. But of course, we also see the downstream impacts on BDS activists more broadly, obviously on campuses, students and professors, but also any local coalition seeking to do BDS work, national organizations like our own or many, many others. And of course, then the individualized bullying and harassment that folks face online when they try to be a part of shifting the discourse or speaking out for Palestinian rights. We also have noted, ways where, like when Palestinian news agencies are attacked, when there's broad kind of public attacks and disinformation campaigns that are about attacking kind of the whole public with disinformation about the topic. And when I thought about how, like, what do we see in terms of the different tactics in, most of these have been described already very well, but I think just wanted to name, to underscore your point, Nadim, around sort of corporate cooperation with Israeli and US security state, that deep collaboration that we see happening, and in the example of Dareen and many, many, many others. You see also tactics that are just like Twitter and Facebook deactivating accounts. We'll hear those kinds of stories all the time. Massive coordinated online bullying and intimidation. So not just an individual being embroiled in a flame war, but like truly that doxing. Attempts to cut off funding streams, like when the BNC was attacked for like the platform by which they were receiving donations during year end, this big fundraising drive, suddenly like a coordinated effort to get that platform to stop working for them. And of course, smear campaigns, especially those directed at young Palestinian students, fighting for their rights on campus through divestment campaigns and the like. And also, of course, the other students that support them, who we do see of obviously being disproportionately people of color, including many Jewish students, really feeling that, feeling the attack, so we see it felt throughout the movement. And I wanted to take a minute to think about where we place, who's to blame? Where is this happening from and how is it coordinated? And We heard an incredible analysis legally of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs role. So that was great to hear. And it was one of the things I was thinking about a lot this week, given Gilad Erdan's appointment that was just announced, that he was just made Israel's ambassador to the UN and the US, a double appointment, which is basically a flare gun saying these tactics that we're talking about this entire webinar are now the focus of the, we're leveling this up. We're taking this in terms of this is actually the mandate of how we're going to relate entirely to the US and to the UN. This is the strategies we're going to double down on. And so, I think Frank did a wonderful job of just detailing much better than I could the specific legal frameworks. And I was thinking about, when I was thinking about Gilad Erdan and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs since they came on the scene, how they've been such a hub and heart of these attacks, and like in the way that we've been talking about it being these coordinated different streams of attacks, and really understanding that ministry has done a very good job of intentionally doing work to build a network that appears non-governmental and distributed, but has a high level of coordination. And that, they, including a secret firm expressly established to wage online mass awareness campaigns, or their kind of network of domestic and international organizations, expressly working to attack individuals and institutions, and their blacklist. That goes on and on what they have done to attack the movement and to Palestinians in particular. But I think really worth us as a whole, ourselves as a movement, really saying, okay, what does it mean that this appointment was made, and how do we use this moment to publicly talk about what can be very shadowy attacks and can be hard to describe to people how it's all coordinated. And so I think there's an opportunity and a kind of obligation to look at that moment. Also, of course, and has already been mentioned very wonderfully, this sort of role of corporate complicity that we need to be looking at in terms of Nadim's remarks, in terms of sort of the cooperation and complicity between state actors in the US and Israel with corporations. So, I think especially in this coronavirus moment, we know that corporations like Facebook and Twitter are going to use the moment, the kind of shock doctrine effect, to shore up their power. And there's a problem with big tech monopolies in general, right? They're dangerous to people and democracy and free speech and free press and social justice movements writ large. And so, in the ways, Dima, you were saying that this is sort of super connected to the way other corporations, these same and other corporations, relate to us and to other movements, from climate denialism to attacks on indigenous rights to right-wing conspiracy spread of disinformation about COVID itself, disruption of elections. So there's a need to, I think about the opportunity to see how interrelated our struggles are in regards to these corporate targets, and think about ways to look for opportunities to have unified demands. We've been really encouraged to get to sign on and be part of the Freedom from Facebook campaign that kind of unifies these demands under a broader banner of the way this impacts multiple movements. And I think it's worth us looking at that as well. And then I also wanted to note, from our positionality as an organization, really seeing the role that American organizations, and in particular Jewish Zionist organizations, have in funding and supporting and providing some moral cover for these kinds of operations. And so whether it's the Canary Mission funding that was exposed in an expose in recent years, that funding was coming from a family foundation also deeply supporting the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, whether it's the Israel on Campus Coalition that's in partnership with Hillel. As a Jewish organization, we feel a responsibility to call that complicity out. Also, it's particularly when it's sort of being done in the name of our communal wellness, or, Hillel should be providing space for students, Jewish students, to have religious and spiritual and cultural life together, not working in partnership with an organization that is shrinking space and providing a chilling effect to a movement for social justice. And so just a couple of takeaways when you kind of put that picture together that's been so beautifully painted by all the panelists today. I think, you know, it's really clear to see how all of these efforts, as you were saying, Dima, you know, work in perfect tandem with one another. It's a holistic plan. They're not little individual attacks. It's a coordinated effort, and they work in coordination with on the ground attacks, with lawfare, with, you know, legislative efforts to create an environment where free speech is incredibly dangerous and where it's high stakes and a gamble, particularly for Palestinians. And so, you know, having personally experienced many of our closest Palestinian partners or organizers, like having to, both in Palestine and Israel and here in the US, like having to weigh imprisonment, ability to travel home and be with family and loved ones, future job prospects, just to tell the truth of their lives is horrifying, you know. And then in less stark ways, pro-Palestinian activists of all kinds facing questions of intimidation and bullying and personal or professional attacks. And as a Jewish organization, we're specifically attuned to the way that anti-Semitism is weaponized in all of these efforts. So, you know, that complete conflation of anti-Semitism with defense of Palestinian rights is a common thread through all of this, right? And we see it threaded through these digital encroachments too. So as a Jew, it's infuriating, frankly, to see our community instrumentalized in that way. It should go without saying that it's, of course, deeply harmful to efforts to fight real anti-Semitism. And it's incredibly concerning to see it used time and again to attack Palestinians and their rights and those who are human rights defenders along with them. And I think finally, I just want to say that it's really I think it's knowing all of that, understanding the full breadth of these attacks and how coordinated and intense and in some ways they are working, you know, to know how deep these attacks go, I think demonstrates to me more than anything the resilience of the movement, right? So it's not that we can't and mustn't like take this extremely seriously and do everything we can to fight and dismantle it as a set of tactics against the movement, but also to see the way that the movement for Palestinian rights led by Palestinians has grown stronger and stronger in the face of this enormous blowback. And that, you know, it's the very indicator, as Dima was saying, of the success and growth of that movement that has amplified and made, you know, Gilad Erdan's appointment underscores that it's both working in the sense of creating really imperiled organizing conditions, but it's not working in the sense of actually truly holding back a movement for rights that is bound to win, you know. So yeah, so I am happy that we're spending the time here. It seems like the really the right thing to be talking about this week as we're thinking about Nakba and thinking about the struggle for justice that is ultimately continuing and will win, and also to notice what we need to do as organizers to really get smart together about what's happening to the movement. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Stefanie, for sharing this with us and also bringing a bit more in about the corporations and the complicity component. I think there's a whole nother talk almost that can happen in that realm. But it's good to also be including this part as we look at the different ways in which this drinking space is manifesting. So hopefully in the future we will get more opportunity, of course, to discuss these issues. But for now, we want to go to the attendees, and we have our first question in the Q&A. I also have seen for a while that Michelle Magennis, you had your hand raised. So I just want to encourage anyone, if they have questions at this part, to please put your question in the Q&A section below. And we will start here with the first question, which comes from Perry Kamek. Dima mentioned that IHRA's working definition of anti-Semitism. It's the basis of the Trump administration's recent executive order and will likely be a major pillar of future intimidation efforts. Given that the general public will probably assume the definition is reasonable, several European countries already endorsed it, what is the best way to deal with the IHRA working definition? So do we have some experts? Raise your hand, panelists. Okay, great. So maybe let's start with Dima.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Perry. You know, that I didn't mention, but of course, you know, this anti-Semitism definition that has been adopted in many European countries was the subject of, as Perry says, an executive order, Trump's executive order in December of last year, basically requiring executive agencies like the Department of Education to consider this definition when investigating complaints of anti-Semitism under civil rights laws. So this has been a tactic for many years to use civil rights laws to complain that, that Palestine organizing is anti-Semitic and that it's threatening to Jewish students, and has failed so far. And this is really the missing link to say, well, this is what qualifies as anti-Semitism and is therefore discriminatory behavior, right? And if universities don't stop it, they're responsible for discrimination. So I think one of the ways that it's really important to push back against this definition is to really show how it's been used. And I think that illustrates its real intent, right? It's not to address a growing problem of anti-Semitism, a resurgence of anti-Semitism that's resulting in real violence and that's perpetrated by white nationalist groups and individuals. It's really intended to address this movement for Palestinian rights that is questioning Israel's, the premise of Israel, Israel's actions and its policies. And the definition makes that very clear. So, you know, to say that Israel is a racist endeavor is considered anti-Semitic under this definition. And some states have, a couple of states have adopted a law that says, you know, if you, for example, if you only, if you have a human rights investigation that's only focused on Israel, that's anti-Semitic, right? So imagine just investigating Israel's human rights abuses is considered anti-Semitic if you don't, you know, look at everyone else's human rights abuses. So, so looking at the ways that it's already been deployed, and we've been tracking this for many years, the way that normal speech activities are labeled under this definition as anti-Semitic is really the proof that we need to say this is aimed at targeting our speech, at targeting the political criticism of a nation state, and not you know, the identity of people, or which is what it's claiming to do, right? And just one example of that is, you know, a recent complaint based on this definition was against a vigil at the University of California, Berkeley, where students were trying to commemorate the loss of lives in the Pittsburgh massacre, the synagogue massacre, and the loss of Palestinian lives by an Israeli attack. And, you know, this vigil was attacked as anti-Semitic because it was a blood libel, and to claim that Israel is responsible for deaths is a blood libel, and under this definition qualifies as anti-Semitism. So, you know, even these pure speech activities that are so clearly, you know, it was by a JVP group and Palestinian students, are the object of these attacks and are being targeted by this. So it's so clear that the intent is to target the speech activities, this movement, the way that that people are really trying to showcase and bring alive the what's going on in Palestine.
And Frank, do you have some things to add regarding this?
Sure, I have lots of thoughts on this, but I'll be brief because I'm conscious of time. I think the experience in the UK is quite instructive because the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, of course, brought that vehicle in a very pro-Palestinian direction, an unprecedented direction, really. And unfortunately, not because of the left in the Labour Party, but because of forces that naively thought that by adopting the IHRA definition, that would somehow accommodate the large volume of bad faith allegations of anti-Semitism that were being made against the Labour Party as an institution. That resulted in the National Executive Committee of the British Labour Party adopting the definition with examples. I think it's important to state that the definition itself is not problematic at all, really. I'm just reading it out. It says, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Now, that strikes me as a very useful definition of a very pernicious form of racism. The problem, of course, comes with the examples, and specifically the example relating to, and I'll read out the example as well. The example that caused so much consternation in the UK was, and I quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Now, there's a few things to say about that. Again, I'll be as brief as I can. Four things that occur to me. The first is that my experience of dealing with Palestinian people fighting for Palestinian emancipation is that Palestinians are not able to ignore the reality of anti-Semitism for a moment. They are incredibly intimately acquainted with the reality of anti-Jewish hatred because the historical manifestations of anti-Jewish hatred, and in particular the horrific violence of the Holocaust, is something that has had such knock-on effects on the Palestinian people. And in that connection, I'd encourage everyone who has an opportunity to investigate a very good an anthology of essays called The Unconscious in Social and Political Life that was released last year and edited by David Morgan. And that includes an essay by Fakhri Davids called Psychoanalysis and Palestine Israel, A Personal Angle. And it's a brilliant account of the way in which Palestinians are excluded from the discourse around the way in which the Holocaust has had a direct impact on Palestinians. So the first thing to say is that Palestinians, in my experience, without wanting to homogenize them and without wanting to ignore the fact that clearly some Palestinians are capable of anti-Semitism, my overwhelming experience, and I think the facts bear this out, is that Palestinians are incredibly sensitive when it comes to genuine forms of anti-Semitism, and having themselves been subjected to dehumanizing forms of racism, are incredibly sensitive to what it means to actually meaningfully oppose anti-Semitism. The second thing I've touched on is labor in the UK. Anyone on this call who's in another country where your institution or your government is contemplating adopting this definition, you need to oppose it. It is not, the definition itself is fine, the examples are not fine. And that brings me to the third point, which is the first limb of the definition, which is essentially correct. It says, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. Now, denying Jews or any group that right plainly is racist. Jews do have a right to self-determination. The problem is the conflation of the Jewish right to self-determination with Zionism. Jews do have a right to self-determination. They don't have a right to dispossess 750,000 people in 1948, to systematically prevent those people from returning to their homes. And so the point is that Zionism is a historical and a contemporary articulation of the Jewish right to self-determination, but it is not coextensive with that right. And making that conflation is deeply problematic because it is entirely justified, turning to the second limb, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. It is, and I use these words advisedly, it is absurd to say to a Palestinian who claims that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, that is an anti-Semitic statement. It is a matter of undisputable historical fact that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. It was a colonial endeavor. It is, and has for some time been governed by an apartheid regime. There is nothing controversial about suggesting that it's a racist endeavor, and there is nothing anti-Semitic about it. And so the final thing I suppose to say is that one of the deep entrenched problems that we face when trying to combat this form of the intersection of these two forms of racism is that anyone seriously committed to anti-racism needs to understand the intimate ways in which anti-Jewish hatred on the one hand and anti-Palestinian hatred on the other are necessarily mutually implicated, and they must be treated in a nuanced way which understands the complex mutual implication of those two forms of racism. Now, the problem is that we're being asked to foreground a deeply neoliberal conception of racism, which focuses on the individual and seeks to conceive of racism in moralistic terms. The alternative is a materialist, historically informed account of racism, which conceives of it in structural terms, understands, for example, the deep structural logic, the deeply embedded anti-Semitism within Western capitalism, the way in which it emerged historically and culminated in the horrific violence of the Holocaust, but also understanding its material manifestation, the material manifestations of anti-Palestinian hatred. Now, I'm conscious I'm talking quite a lot, so perhaps I'll leave it there. But the bright line, I think, on the IHRA is, thank you for the question. It's an important point, and if and where it comes up, I think we need to subject it to the kind of critique that those on the call have attempted to sketch out for you tonight. Oh, Alison, you're muted.
Oh, okay, there we go, back. It's getting late over here, so we have just a few more minutes, and we just got another question. And again, if there are any questions, I just want to encourage anyone, big or small questions. You do not need to be an expert on this issue. We are really happy to answer anything basic or anything really complicated and specific. So please feel free. And we are going to take now, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Let's see. Are there efforts by activists to address censorship of Palestinian activism online and social media companies themselves? There have been reports of Facebook and other unnecessary takedowns of pro-Palestinian content. So I'm going to turn the Zoom over to Nadim if he would like to speak on this topic, and anyone else.
Yeah, so there have been ongoing efforts to try to influence the policies of content moderation of Facebook and the other social media platforms. Some of these are through kind of public protest, through letters, statements, etc. And the other side of it is having ongoing some kind of negotiation regarding specific content. So sometimes we do have successes in having posts that were taken off, or some pages of Palestinian journalists or others who are working for pro-justice causes, and their pages have or accounts have been suspended, putting them back on specific issues. But honestly, the general policy of there's a problem in the general policy of content moderation. The time that you, as a social media company, adapt basically the definitions of the Israeli government, in the same time that you are taking the control of the Israeli government on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, as it was a democratic elected government, and you take their decisions regarding, for example, if a teenager in Bethlehem have a post about something around Al-Aqsa, and the Israeli cyber unit asked Facebook to take down his account or the post, and they do positively that, this is obviously very problematic from different angles. Freedom of expression, but also from the side, like which kind of laws they are following. Because the basic argument normally of Facebook that we follow the local law. And in this case, like which law? The Israeli law, the international law, the Palestinian law, etc. So it's very problematic approaches. We are trying to push for a more transparent, clear, objective ideas or set of way of doing the content moderation. By the way, together with other alliances from other areas where there is occupation or conflict, and to have Facebook running this in a more transparent way, because what we find more and more is basically they lean to the governments. They lean to the strong side, to the one that will give them the opportunity to function and to work and to have ads and to have money, because in the end of the day, it's a profitable company, and this is the main interest. One last point to say, another sad moment is that basically the recently appointed Amy Palmore. Amy Palmore was until recently the general director of the Israeli Ministry of Justice, and she was leading the work of this cyber unit we were speaking about, and she was leading the work to silence people. She's now appointed to the oversight board of Facebook, which is basically the kind of Supreme Court of Facebook, on content moderation policies. She's one of 20 international personalities that were chosen. And this is very problematic, like to bring the person who specifically was responsible to work against freedom of expression of people and for closing down pages, and to appoint her in the committee that's supposed to oversight and to protect the freedom of expression. This just shows how much problematic the policies of Facebook.
Great. We did have two or three other questions come in now. So if anyone has something hot on this topic,
can I just add one quick thing, Alison, and then, but just briefly, I'm just going to pop in the chat a broad coalition. I mentioned that we were a part of at JVP called Freedom from Facebook and Google that is seeking to break up the conglomerateness of them as corporations, which obviously is connected to the way Nadim just explained what's going on. So I'm just going to pop that in the chat.
Okay, that's great. And actually, Nadim, just while we have you, there is a kind of a question maybe that you can answer quickly, and then we can go on to the others, which might require a little more elaboration. And this comes from, and it's a really good question, from Nazil, Nazli. She thanks the panelists, and she is asking, she's a legal researcher at the, oh, I'm sorry. The chat, the questions moved while I was looking, so that question's for Frank, actually. But actually, the question was about, as we ask youth to be raising their voices, what can we do to keep youth safe online, and what can we do, more generally to keep our communities safe online? So we can start with Nadim, and then if others have something to add to this, I think it's a really important point. A question, sorry.
Yeah, so basically we have in Hamle, we have been working a lot around this issue, like how to educate youngsters to be more, let's say, a sophisticated user of social media. And in a way, obviously, because the point is that there are so many threats that, as I spoke before, there is the chill effect that people refrain from social media and do not speak, do not post their opinion. And we do want youth to be there. We do want to have a more democratic life where people share their opinions and have these live, vivid discussions, and not to refrain from the social media. But our message is basically to try to be a much more sophisticated user of social media, or much more smart user of the social media, in a sense, to know also the limits and the responsibility, and to know as a young person that you also have responsibility for what you are saying and what you're writing. On the other hand, also that it's very important to work more and more on issues of digital security, because there is much more threat, and not only to teenagers, but also to older ages, to activists, to people who are part of NGOs, trying to get their personal information, to hack their accounts, and to intimidate them for their political opinions. So it's important to have this also, to educate ourselves on a basic, at least basic measures of digital security, how to protect ourselves and privacy in a better way.
Does anyone else have something you want to add to this topic, just briefly?
I mean, I think the other point, I agree, Nadim, is I think digital security has become a much more important right now. And the other thing which I alluded to earlier, I think, is that it's just the importance of having a support system, that people don't find themselves alone when they're attacked, that we have to stand up and defend each other and make sure that people aren't hung out to dry, that they don't face any potential consequences alone, and that we really neutralize the effects of these efforts, right? So just one example is with Canary Mission, we've had situations where, we've advocated with universities to take measures to neutralize the effect of Canary Mission on students. Professors have written a letter, 1,000 professors wrote a letter saying, we don't take this seriously. This is not a reliable source of information when we're looking at students, just as an example, but to really neutralize the effects of these attacks and undermine their purpose.
Great. So we have one final question, and actually it's a great wrap-up question. This comes from Elaine. And she asks us, in contemplating the systematic thinking of, shrinking of space and chilling effect that we discussed this evening, what do you imagine is the impact of COVID and increased efforts to track and trace technology on activists that are working on this issue? Yeah, so maybe, does anyone want to go first? Raise your...
I mean, I can go first. I mean, obviously, COVID-19 is not helpful at all for us. It made much more legitimacy for governments generally, globally, to take steps and legislations and regulations that are harming privacy of the citizens in a very serious way. And the discussion around the balance between public health and the privacy, obviously, it's leaning more towards public health. The concern is that these regulations and legislations that are happening will stay with us even after the crisis, at least in the oppressive regimes. And in Israel specifically, the Israeli have been taking measures. I mean, we discovered so many things that are happening by the Israeli government that normally the Israeli media or the Israeli establishment will not allow anybody to speak about them, including the tool, which is basically a huge database of recording all the telecommunication in Israeli telecommunication system. So everything is have been recorded since the beginning of the second Intifada until today. The Hawkeye, which is another system of the Israeli police, basically around cars and plates, etc. There's the Magennis, which is the health ministry application, was supposed to be a little bit easier than the rest. And there is the Secret Services monitoring sick people in Corona, etc. So there are so many things that are happening, and the government, specifically with the Israeli government, feeling much more like confident to speak about these things, and even to declare that they are even surveilling Israeli Jewish citizens, which normally they will not speak about in these circumstances. So it's just a bad news in terms of making much more challenges for us.
Does anyone else have any thoughts about how this may impact shrinking space? Okay, great. So we really thank everyone who joined us here tonight. We had up to 50 panel attendees joining us, and each of the panelists with your diverse experience and knowledge. We really appreciate you taking time to contribute to the conversation about digital rights, Palestine, and we look forward to continuing to follow your research and your work, sharing about this issue online, and considering how as a community we can organize to protect our space for freedom of expression. And also, I really want to thank all of your organizations, especially, and you as individuals, for showing up and for expressing yourself, all of those who you contributed in the Q&A, and we hope to see you all soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Yes,
You all.
good to see you
Have a good
all.
evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.
Bye.